The cool, polished marble of the bank floor reflected the crisp autumn sunlight streaming through the towering glass facade. It felt alien beneath Emma's simple flats, the sort of surface meant for the clicking of Louboutins, not the soft thud of her worn soles. She adjusted the strap of her modest handbag, a nervous flutter in her stomach contrasting with the glacial calm of the space. This was Hartwell Bank, a temple of finance, a place where fortunes were made and broken. And today, Emma hoped to make a small, precious purchase from its most exclusive vault. A gift, a gesture, a tangible symbol of her love for Michael. Two women, impeccably dressed in tailored suits that screamed designer labels, stood near the velvet ropes guarding the premium services area. Their hushed conversation ceased as Emma approached, their gazes sweeping over her with a mixture of appraisal and disdain. Emma felt a familiar prickle of self-consciousness. She knew she didn't belong here, not in this world of gleaming surfaces and hushed whispers. But the watch, the one Michael had admired with a wistful glint in his eyes, resided within those guarded walls. She had to try. "I'd like to access the premium services area, please," Emma said, her voice a touch softer than intended. The taller of the two women, Vivian Hull, the branch manager whose name Emma had painstakingly memorized from the bank's website, arched a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Can I help you find a regular teller line?" The words were polite, but the tone dripped with condescension. Emma swallowed, the marble suddenly feeling colder beneath her feet. "No, I need to speak with someone about a specific item in the vault." Her gaze shifted to the other woman, Rebecca Thornton, the vice president, who was openly examining Emma's shoes with a barely concealed smirk. "I really should screen who they let in these days," Rebecca murmured to Vivian, loud enough for Emma to hear. The casual cruelty of the remark sent a wave of heat rushing to Emma's face. This wasn't just about her appearance. It was about their perception of her worth, a worth they deemed insignificant based on the fabric of her clothes. Emma took a deep breath, reminding herself of Michael's words, his gentle reassurance that she was more than enough. She straightened her spine, a quiet defiance blossoming within her. "I need to speak with the branch manager, please," she repeated, her voice firmer this time. "It's urgent." Vivian sighed dramatically, her perfectly manicured hand gesturing toward a cluster of plush chairs. "If you insist, though I doubt there's anything we can do for you." The dismissive wave, the barely concealed eye roll, it all grated on Emma's nerves. This was more than just bad customer service. It was a calculated act of humiliation, a subtle reminder of her perceived place in the world. As she walked towards the seating area, a uniformed security guard stepped in front of her, his stance subtly blocking her path. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right place?" he asked, his tone mirroring the disdain of the two women. Emma closed her eyes for a fleeting moment, fighting back the urge to flee, to disappear back into the anonymity of the bustling city outside. But the image of Michael's face, the quiet joy she knew this gift would bring him, steeled her resolve. "I am here to make a purchase," she stated, her voice calm but unwavering. "A rather significant one. I require access to the vault." The guard's eyes flickered down to her handbag again, his expression skeptical. Before he could respond, a familiar voice echoed through the hushed lobby. "Emma? What's going on?" The sudden shift in atmosphere was palpable. The air crackled with a sudden tension, the hushed whispers ceasing abruptly. Vivian and Rebecca, their faces frozen in mid-sneer, turned to see Michael Hartwell striding towards them, his expression unreadable. Emma's heart leaped in her chest, a mixture of relief and a strange sense of vindication. She hadn't realized how much the subtle insults had chipped away at her composure until she saw her husband's face, his presence a solid anchor in the sea of disdain she had been navigating. "Michael," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible above the sudden, nervous rustling of papers from the nearby desks. He reached her side, his hand gently clasping hers, his thumb stroking the back of her hand in a silent gesture of comfort and reassurance. "I was just explaining to these helpfulities that I need to access the vault," Emma said, her voice regaining some of its strength under his protective gaze. Michael's gaze swept over Vivian and Rebecca, his eyes lingering on the security guard who still stood awkwardly nearby. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a scene, yet his presence radiated an undeniable authority, a silent power that filled the vast lobby. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice deceptively soft. Vivian stammered, her carefully crafted composure crumbling under his gaze. "Mr. Hartwell, we didn't realize we thought—" Michael cut her off, his voice still calm, but laced with a chilling edge. "You thought what, Vivian? That my wife, the woman who holds my heart and shares my name, doesn't belong in your establishment?" He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. "You made assumptions based on her appearance, on the clothes she chooses to wear, the shoes she chooses to walk in." He squeezed Emma's hand, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "My wife values substance over superficiality, a quality I deeply admire. Clearly, those values aren't shared within these walls." The silence that followed was deafening. James, the bank's president, emerged from his office, his face paling as he took in the scene. He rushed towards Michael, his voice a flurry of apologies. "Mr. Hartwell, I am so sorry for this misunderstanding. This is completely unacceptable. I will deal with this immediately." He turned to Vivian and Rebecca, his voice sharp and laced with barely controlled fury. "You're both fired. Effective immediately. Security, please escort these ladies out of the building." The swiftness of the dismissal, the public humiliation mirroring what they had inflicted on Emma moments before, was almost poetic. As the security guards led the stunned women away, Michael turned to James, his voice regaining its usual calm. "This incident, James, is a symptom of a larger problem, a systemic disregard for basic human decency and respect. I expect more from an institution that bears my name." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the now silent lobby. "I suggest you take some time to reflect on the values you truly represent, and perhaps invest in some training for your staff. Training on how to recognize true worth, which, as you have so clearly witnessed today, has little to do with the price of a handbag or the label on a shoe." The hushed opulence of the premium banking area pressed in on Emma like velvet drapes. Sunlight, filtered through the towering windows, glinted off polished marble floors and the chrome accents of designer furniture. A faint scent of sandalwood hung in the air, a subtle reminder of the wealth that permeated every inch of this space. Emma clutched her worn handbag, its simple leather a stark contrast to the glossy briefcases and designer purses clutched by the other patrons. Her sensible shoes clicked softly against the marble, a counterpoint to the muted whispers and the rustling of financial documents. A nervous flutter danced in her stomach. This wasn't her world. She knew that. But today it had to be. A uniformed security guard, his posture stiff and his expression impassive, blocked her path. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering a beat too long on her modest attire. Emma felt her cheeks flush, a familiar heat rising from her neck. She straightened her spine, a silent defiance against the unspoken judgment in his eyes. "I need to speak with someone about a special purchase," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt thin, inadequate in this cavern of hushed voices and discreet transactions. "This section is for premium clients only, ma'am." The guard's voice was a practiced monotone, devoid of any warmth. He crossed his arms, a subtle but clear barrier. Emma swallowed, the lump in her throat growing. She had anticipated this. She'd rehearsed what she would say, how she would hold herself. But the reality of the situation, the weight of the unspoken dismissal, was heavier than she'd imagined. "I understand," Emma replied, forcing a calmness she didn't feel. "But I'm here to arrange for a special purchase that requires access to the vault." The word vault felt foreign on her tongue. She tried to ignore the curious glances from the other clients, the subtle whispers that seemed to dissect her appearance, her presence, her very right to be here. The guard's expression remained unchanged. "I'm afraid I can't allow you access without proper authorization. Perhaps you can inquire at the general service desks?" His tone suggested that she was wasting his time, that she belonged in a different world entirely. Before Emma could respond, a woman emerged from a nearby office. She wore a tailored suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a sleek chignon. Her name tag identified her as Vivian Hull, branch manager. Vivian's smile, as she approached, didn't quite reach her eyes. "Is there a problem, Gerald?" she asked the guard, her voice smooth, polished. "This woman is inquiring about accessing the premium services area," the guard replied, his tone clipped. He gestured towards Emma with a slight tilt of his head, a gesture that felt dismissive, almost contemptuous. Vivian's gaze swept over Emma, a swift, assessing look that seemed to take in every detail of her appearance. The faint smile on her lips tightened, becoming almost imperceptible. "Our premium services are exclusively for clients with significant portfolios, madam," Vivian said, her voice laced with a subtle condescension that grated on Emma's nerves. The unspoken message hung heavy in the air. "You don't belong here." A wave of humiliation washed over Emma. She felt her face burning, her hands clenching into fists inside her handbag. For a moment, she wanted to turn and flee, to escape the suffocating judgment of this place. But the image of Michael, his smile, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners where he laughed, flashed through her mind. This was for him. She wouldn't be deterred. "I'm aware of the requirements," Emma said, her voice steadier than she expected. "However, I believe my husband's portfolio qualifies." She hated having to invoke Michael's name, to use his influence as a shield against their prejudice. But she had no other choice. Vivian's eyebrows arched, a perfect expression of skepticism. "Your husband?" she repeated, the tone implying doubt. "Michael Hartwell," Emma said, the name hanging in the air, a silent challenge. The effect was instantaneous. Vivian's carefully constructed composure faltered. A flicker of recognition, followed by a subtle shift in her demeanor, crossed her face. A nearby couple, who had been openly observing the exchange, exchanged hushed whispers. Their earlier smirks vanished, replaced by expressions of stunned silence. Even the security guard, Gerald, seemed to stiffen, his posture shifting from casual dismissal to wary attention. Vivian's voice, when she spoke again, was noticeably smoother, almost solicitous. "Mr. Hartwell, of course," she said, a forced smile returning to her lips. "I apologize for the misunderstanding. We naturally prioritize the privacy and security of our most valued clients. If you had identified yourself earlier," the words hung unfinished, a flimsy attempt to backpedal. Emma felt a surge of anger, a bitter taste rising in her throat. It wasn't about security or privacy. It was about appearances, about the silent judgments made based on the clothes she wore, the bag she carried. Before Emma could respond, a deep voice cut through the hushed atmosphere. "Is there a problem, Emma?" The question, though gentle, carried an undercurrent of steel. Emma turned, her heart leaping with a mixture of relief and a strange sense of trepidation. Michael stood just inside the entrance to the premium banking area, his presence commanding attention. His expression was calm, almost serene, but his eyes, sharp and observant, scanned the scene, taking in every detail. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Who had dared to slight his wife? The plush carpet hushed Emma's footsteps as she stood, a solitary figure amidst the gleaming chrome and polished marble. Sunlight streamed through the panoramic windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, each one seeming to mock her insignificance in this opulent space. Vivian Hull's words, sharp as shards of glass, echoed in her ears. 7 figures. The number hung in the air, a chasm between her and the world this bank catered to. Emma's hand instinctively went to the small, worn leather purse clutched at her side. Inside lay the carefully saved funds, enough for the antique watch she'd been eyeing for Michael's anniversary. It wasn't a fortune, not by this bank's standards, but it represented months of quiet sacrifices, of foregone luxuries she barely noticed anymore. Perhaps it's a mistake, a small voice whispered in her mind. Perhaps I should just leave. But the thought of Michael's face, The quiet joy he'd surely express at receiving the gift steeled her resolve. She straightened her simple dress, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. "I understand," she said, her voice softer than she intended, "but I would still like to inquire about purchasing an item from your vault." Vivian Hull exchanged a look with a woman who had just approached, her tailored suit and immaculate hairstyle screaming authority. This, Emma realized with a sinking feeling, must be Rebecca Thornton, the vice president. Rebecca's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Is there a problem, Vivian?" she asked, her voice smooth as silk, yet laced with an undercurrent of steel. "This woman," Vivian began, her tone dripping with condescension, "seems to be under the impression she qualifies for our premium services. I've explained our criteria, but—" She trailed off, gesturing dismissively towards Emma. Rebecca Thornton's gaze swept over Emma, taking in her modest attire, the slightly worn handbag, the quiet dignity she held despite the humiliation burning in her cheeks. A flicker of something cold and calculating crossed Rebecca's face. "Perhaps we're not communicating clearly," she said, her voice laced with a saccharine sweetness that grated on Emma's nerves. "This section serves clients with accounts exceeding 7 figures. Are you certain you meet that requirement?" Emma's hands tightened around her purse. The blood rushed in her ears, a roaring tide threatening to drown out the carefully constructed composure she'd maintained. 7 figures. The phrase was a slap, a public branding of her inadequacy. She opened her mouth to speak, to explain, to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? That her husband, the man who loved her, the man she loved, possessed wealth beyond their wildest dreams? That she chose simplicity, that the quiet comfort of their life together meant more than any display of opulence? The words felt hollow, meaningless in the face of their disdain. Rebecca Thornton sighed, a theatrical display of impatience. "People like you waste our time every day," she said, her voice dropping the pretense of politeness. "The difference between you and our actual clients is as obvious as that department store dress you're wearing." The cruelty of her words hit Emma with the force of a physical blow. Shame, hot and stinging, washed over her. She had never felt so small, so utterly insignificant. "Just leave," her inner voice screamed. "Just walk away." "I believe I asked you to leave," Vivian Hull said, her voice sharp and edged with triumph. She gestured to a nearby security guard, a large man with a stoic expression. "Please escort this woman out." The guard approached, his presence looming large and intimidating. He placed a hand on Emma's arm, his grip firm but not unkind. "Ma'am," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "I need you to come with me." The gentle touch, the unexpected kindness, was the final straw. Tears pricked at Emma's eyes. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the plush carpet and escape the judging stares. Just as the guard began to lead her away, a voice, deep and resonant, cut through the tense atmosphere. "Is there a problem here?" Every head in the bank swiveled towards the sound. Standing in the doorway, a figure of quiet power and undeniable authority, was Michael Hartwell. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept over the scene, taking in his wife's flushed cheeks, the security guard's hand on her arm, the smug expressions of Vivian Hull and Rebecca Thornton. A muscle twitched in his jaw. The air crackled with an unspoken tension. Emma's heart leaped into her throat. Relief, sharp and overwhelming, washed over her, followed by a wave of fresh humiliation. He had seen it all. He had witnessed her humiliation, her powerlessness. Michael's gaze settled on Vivian Hull. "I believe my wife was asking about purchasing an item from your vault," he said, his voice calm and measured, yet carrying an undercurrent of steel. Vivian Hull, her face paling rapidly, stammered, "Mr. Hartwell, there seems to have been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Michael repeated, his voice soft, dangerously so. He stepped closer, his presence filling the room. "I believe I heard Miss Thornton comment on my wife's attire, and I distinctly recall the mention of 7 figures." His gaze shifted to Rebecca Thornton, who now stood frozen, her carefully crafted composure crumbling. Mr. Hartwell, I assure you, she began, but he cut her off with a wave of his hand. Assurances are unnecessary, he said, his voice now laced with ice. He turned to James, the branch president, who had hurried over, his face a mask of anxious concern. James, Michael said, his voice deceptively calm, I believe a change in management is in order. I expect Ms. Hull and Ms. Thornton's resignations on my desk by the end of the day. James, his face now ashen, could only nod. The silence in the bank was absolute, broken only by the quiet ticking of the grand clock on the wall. Each tick seemed to echo the finality of Michael's words, the swift and decisive fall from grace of the two women whom moments before had held so much power. Michael turned to Emma, his gaze softening. He took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. Let's discuss that watch, he murmured, his voice filled with a tenderness that only she could hear. As they walked towards the vault, leaving the stunned silence in their wake, Emma felt a surge of something complex and profound gratitude, love, and a quiet satisfaction that justice, in its own way, had been served. The humiliation still lingered, a faint ache in her chest, but it was overshadowed by the warmth of his hand in hers, a silent promise of a life built on something far more valuable than 7 figures in a bank account. The heavy silence that descended upon the opulent bank lobby was palpable, a stark contrast to the hushed murmurs and clicking heels that had preceded it. Every head turned, drawn by an invisible magnetic force towards the entrance. Emma's heart, moments ago constricted by humiliation, now fluttered with a strange mixture of apprehension and relief. Michael. He stood there, framed by the afternoon sunlight streaming through the glass doors, his presence filling the space not with volume, but with an undeniable weight. His gaze, sharp and unwavering, landed on the security guard's hand still gripping her arm. A muscle twitched in his jaw, the only outward sign of the controlled fury simmering beneath his composed exterior. Remove your hand from my wife. The words were quiet, almost conversational, yet they resonated through the lobby, carrying an undercurrent of steel. Emma could almost hear the collective intake of breath. The guard, a young man with a freshly pressed uniform and a name tag that read Kevin, recoiled as if burned. His hand dropped away from her arm like a hot coal. He stammered an apology, his face paling beneath the tan. Emma, caught in the eye of the storm, felt a complex wave of emotions wash over her. Shame lingered, a bitter residue of the humiliation she had endured, yet a new sensation began to bloom, in its place a quiet sense of vindication. She had not imagined this scenario, not in her wildest dreams. She had envisioned a quiet purchase, a special gift tucked away for their anniversary, a secret shared between them. Now this public display, this raw exposure of the bank's ingrained prejudice. A part of her wished it hadn't happened this way. Yet another part, a small rebellious flicker, felt a strange satisfaction. Michael's gaze shifted from the guard to Vivian Hull, the branch manager, whose carefully constructed facade of professional courtesy had crumbled, revealing the disdain beneath. He took a step forward, each movement deliberate, measured. The expensive Italian leather of his shoes seemed to whisper against the polished marble floor. You believe respect is something to be rationed based on bank balances and designer labels? His voice, though still controlled, held a glacial edge. Vivian opened her mouth to speak, to offer some flimsy excuse, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't conceal the flicker of fear that crossed her features. Emma watched her, a detached observer of her own unfolding drama. She had seen this fear before, in boardrooms and negotiation tables, in the eyes of those who underestimated Michael's quiet power. It was the fear of facing a force they couldn't comprehend, a power they couldn't control. Rebecca Thornton, the vice president, stepped forward, her face a mask of strained composure. Mr. Hartwell, I assure you, there's been a misunderstanding. Her voice trailed off, her carefully chosen words disintegrating under the weight of his gaze. He didn't interrupt, didn't even acknowledge her attempt at damage control. He simply looked at her, his silence more damning than any shouted accusation. Rebecca's carefully constructed composure began to crack, her eyes darting nervously towards James, the branch president, who had emerged from his office, his face etched with a mixture of confusion and alarm. James, a man accustomed to smooth operations and hushed deference, struggled to regain control of the situation. "Michael, what seems to be the problem?" He directed the question to Michael, a subtle but clear indication of where he perceived the power lay. Michael didn't answer him directly. Instead, he gestured towards Emma. "My wife came here today to purchase a gift. She was met with suspicion, disrespect, and outright hostility. She was judged not on her character or her intentions, but on her attire." His voice, though calm, held a resonant quality that commanded attention. Every word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. James, a seasoned reader of social cues, finally understood the gravity of the situation. He glanced at Vivian and Rebecca, his expression hardening. The unspoken question hung between them. "What did you do?" "Mr. Hartwell, I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience your wife has experienced. I assure you, this is not representative of our bank's values," he began, his voice laced with practiced diplomacy. Michael cut him short. "Your apologies are meaningless. Your values are clearly displayed in the actions of your staff." He turned his gaze back to Vivian and Rebecca, his eyes like chips of ice. "You're dismissed, effective immediately." The words, delivered without a trace of emotion, landed like a final judgment. The blood drained from Vivian's face, leaving her a ghastly white. Rebecca's carefully maintained facade finally shattered, her eyes widening in disbelief. James, caught between the demands of corporate protocol and the undeniable force of Michael's presence, made a split-second decision. He knew which side his bread was buttered on. "Security, please escort these individuals from the premises." He directed the order to the now recovering Kevin, who, with a visible sense of relief, moved to comply. The silence that followed was different from the earlier hush. This was not the silence of anticipation, but the stunned aftermath of a power play, a swift and decisive execution of justice. Emma watched the two women being led away, their faces contorted in a mixture of shock and indignation. A strange sense of detachment settled over her. She felt neither triumph nor pity, only a weary understanding of the intricate dance of power and perception that governed their world. Michael turned to her, his gaze softening. He reached out, his hand enveloping hers. The warmth of his touch, a familiar anchor in the turbulent sea of emotions, grounded her. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The silent understanding between them, forged over years of shared experiences, spoke volumes. He had defended her, not just as his wife, but as a person deserving of respect. And in that moment, amidst the hushed whispers and stunned faces of the bank's elite clientele, Emma felt a profound sense of connection, not to the world of wealth and privilege that now surrounded her, but to the man who stood beside her, his quiet strength her shield against the world's casual cruelties. The revolving doors of the First National Bank whispered as Emma and Michael stepped back onto the bustling city street. The cool evening air, a stark contrast to the sterile atmosphere of the bank, kissed Emma's face. She took a deep breath, the scent of exhaust fumes and street food momentarily eclipsing the lingering metallic tang of anxiety. Inside, the scene had played out like a bizarre, unsettling dream. Vivian's strained smile, Rebecca's hastily muttered apologies, James's pale, trembling hands, they were etched into her memory. A small, involuntary tremor ran through her. It wasn't fear, not anymore. It was the aftershock of indignation, the residue of a battle fought and won, not with weapons, but with the quiet strength of her own self-worth. Michael's hand, warm and firm, enveloped hers. He didn't speak, but the silent pressure of his fingers was a reassuring anchor in the turbulent sea of her emotions. He knew, she realized, that words wouldn't suffice. This wasn't a moment for platitudes or reassurances. It was a moment for quiet solidarity, for the unspoken understanding that bound them together. She glanced at him, his profile sharp against the backdrop of the setting sun. His usual composure, that carefully constructed mask of power and control, had slipped slightly. A flicker of raw anger still lingered in the depths of his eyes, a testament to the protective fury he'd unleashed within the bank's hallowed halls. It was a side of him she rarely saw, a side reserved for those moments when the things he held most precious were threatened. The chauffeur held the car door open, and they slid into the cool, leather-scented interior. As the city lights blurred past the tinted windows, Emma found herself replaying the events in her mind. The initial sting of Vivian's dismissive glance, the patronizing tone of Rebecca's voice, the security guard's imposing figure barring her path, each moment was a pinprick, a tiny wound that collectively bled a deep sense of humiliation. Yet, paradoxically, she also felt a strange sense of liberation. The incident, as unpleasant as it was, had stripped bare the veneer of politeness and revealed the ugliness that lurked beneath. It had forced her to confront a truth she had perhaps subconsciously acknowledged for a long time. That in the eyes of some, her worth was measured not by her character, but by the perceived size of her bank account. "Are you all right, Emma?" Michael's voice, low and resonant, broke through her thoughts. "Yes," she replied, her voice steadier than she expected. "Just processing." She looked down at her hands, still clasped in his. Her simple, unadorned wedding band, a stark contrast to the glittering jewels she could have easily afforded, suddenly felt like a symbol of defiance, a quiet assertion of her true values. "It's strange," she mused, "how easily they judged me." Michael squeezed her hand. "They judged a book by its cover, Emma, and they were profoundly mistaken." The elevator whisked them up to their penthouse apartment, a sanctuary high above the city's clamor. As they stepped inside, the familiar scent of lilies and jasmine enveloped them, a soothing balm to Emma's frayed nerves. The expansive living room, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. Yet, tonight, the glittering cityscape held little allure. Emma's gaze was drawn to the framed photograph on the mantelpiece, a picture of them taken on their wedding day, their faces radiant with love and hope. It was a reminder of the foundation upon which their life together was built, a foundation that transcended the superficial trappings of wealth. Later, as they sat together on the balcony, the city lights twinkling like a scattered handful of diamonds, Michael showed her a news article on his phone. It detailed the incident at the bank, albeit with a discreet omission of their names. Vivian Hull had quietly resigned from her position, her career seemingly evaporating overnight. Rebecca Thornton, facing more serious allegations of misconduct, had been blacklisted from the financial industry. James, the branch president, was undergoing a rigorous internal review, his future hanging precariously in the balance. Emma read the article in silence, a complex tapestry of emotions weaving through her. There was a sense of satisfaction, of course, that justice had been served. But there was also a lingering unease, a quiet understanding of the ripple effect their actions had created. Lives had been irrevocably altered, careers shattered. She wondered about the families affected, the collateral damage inflicted in the pursuit of accountability. "It feels heavy," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael put his arm around her, drawing her close. "Change often comes at a cost, Emma. But sometimes that cost is necessary." He paused, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "They chose to disrespect you, to diminish you based on their own narrow perceptions. They had to face the consequences of their actions." Emma leaned against him, the warmth of his body a comforting presence. She knew he was right. She also knew that the incident had revealed something profound, not just about the bank's culture, but about herself. It had reaffirmed her belief in the enduring power of dignity, the quiet strength that came from within. Respect wasn't something money could buy. It was something she had always carried within her. And that, she realized, was a wealth far greater than any bank account could hold. The city lights shimmered below, a million tiny sparks against the velvet canvas of the night. And in the quiet intimacy of their balcony, Emma found a sense of peace, a quiet certainty that the world, despite its imperfections, still held a glimmer of hope.